47-year-old James Craig stood in the Arapahoe County District Court in Centennial, Colorado, on July the 30th, 2025, his face expressionless as the jury foreperson rose to announce the verdict that would seal his fate after a 2-week trial that exposed how this respected Aurora dentist had spent 10 agonizing days in March 2023, systematically poisoning his wife Angela Craig, a 43-year-old mother of 6, with a deadly cocktail of cyanide, arsenic, and tetrahydrozoline found in eye drops, spiking her protein shakes, refilling her antibiotic capsules with poison, and ultimately administering a lethal injection of cyanide while she lay helpless in her hospital bed on March 15, 2023, all because he felt trapped in their 23-year marriage and wanted to start fresh with his orthodontist mistress without the financial burden of divorce. As the verdict of guilty of first-degree murder echoed through the packed courtroom, where Angela's friends and family had gathered for weeks hoping for justice, James Craig, who had used his medical knowledge to calculate precise doses of poison that would mimic natural illness, who had ordered cyanide and arsenic online using his dental practice accounts, thinking no one would trace the purchases, and who had even tried to orchestrate a murder-for-hire plot from jail to kill the lead detective investigating him, finally understood that his elaborate scheme had failed, undone by the meticulous work of investigators, the testimony of his own children who testified against him, and most devastatingly, by Angela's own words written in journal entries discovered by police that showed she was planning a future, moving forward from past depression, and had no intention of taking her own life despite James's desperate attempts to fabricate evidence suggesting suicide. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The defense had tried to use Angela's old journal entries from 2009 and 2018, where she had written about feeling depressed to suggest she might have been suicidal. But prosecutors demolished this theory by showing the jury Angela's recent writings, her plans for the future, her excitement about her children's activities, and the devastating timeline that proved James had purchased poisons days before Angela's mysterious illness began, had searched online for how to make murder look like natural death and undetectable poisons, and had sent romantic messages to his mistress saying he would soon be free to be with her. This is the story of how a dentist who took an oath to do no harm instead became a calculated poisoner who tortured his wife over 10 days of excruciating illness, while she begged doctors to help her understand what was wrong, how he manipulated his own children and family to help him maintain his facade of the concerned husband, and how his medical expertise that he thought would help him commit the perfect crime instead became the evidence that convicted him when toxicology tests revealed lethal concentrations of poisons that could only have been administered deliberately by someone with knowledge of pharmacology and access to controlled substances. James Stephen Craig was born in 1978 in the United States and pursued his dream of becoming a dentist, earning his Doctor of Dental Surgery degree and eventually establishing a successful dental practice in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb of Denver. By all outward appearances, James was a model professional, well respected in the community, active in his children's school activities, financially successful with a thriving practice that generated significant income, and married to Angela, his college sweetheart, whom he had wed in 2000 when they were both young and full of dreams about building a life together. Angela Craig, born Angela Lowry in 1979, was described by everyone who knew her as the heart of her family, warm, nurturing, deeply devoted to her 6 children ranging in age from elementary school to college, active in her church, and supportive of James's dental career, even as it required long hours and significant time away from home. Angela had met James in the late 1990s, and their relationship had seemed like a fairy tale at first. He was ambitious and driven, she was caring and supportive, and together they built what appeared to be the American dream: a beautiful home in Aurora, 6 healthy children, financial security, and respect in their community. But beneath this picture-perfect exterior, the Craig marriage had been deteriorating for years. James had begun having affairs as early as the mid-2010s, engaging in relationships with dental assistants, patients, and other women he met through his practice or online. He was living a double life: the devoted family man at home, the serial philanderer when away from his wife and children. Angela knew about at least some of James's infidelities and had confronted him multiple times. But like many spouses in similar situations, she chose to try to salvage the marriage for the sake of their children and their shared history. In 2019, James's sexual addiction and serial cheating came to a crisis point when he confessed to Angela and some close friends that he was struggling with compulsive sexual behavior and had even contemplated murder-suicide, killing himself and drugging Angela so she couldn't stop him. This confession, witnessed by Angela's friend Nicole Harmon and her husband, should have been a massive red flag that James was capable of violence and had already been fantasizing about killing his wife. But Angela, demonstrating the compassion and forgiveness that would ultimately cost her life, decided to stay in the marriage and help James work through his issues with therapy and counseling. By late 2022 and early 2023, the Craig marriage was in its final death spiral. James had begun yet another affair, this time with a fellow orthodontist he had met through professional circles. This relationship was different from his previous flings. James was genuinely emotionally invested, talking about leaving Angela, building a future with this new woman, and escaping what he increasingly described as feeling trapped in his marriage. But divorce would be financially devastating for James. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, meaning marital assets are divided fairly, but not necessarily equally in divorce proceedings. And with 6 children, Angela would be entitled to significant child support and spousal support that would drain James's income for years. James began contemplating an alternative solution. What if Angela simply died? If she were to pass away from what appeared to be natural causes or suicide, James would inherit their shared assets, receive life insurance proceeds, avoid child support and alimony payments, and be free to pursue his relationship with his mistress without the financial burden of divorce. As a dentist with extensive knowledge of pharmacology, access to medical resources, and understanding of how the human body processes substances, James believed he could commit the perfect crime, poisoning Angela slowly in a way that would mimic natural illness or be attributed to suicide, allowing him to play the grieving widower while secretly celebrating his freedom. In late February and early March 2023, James began researching poisons and methods of killing that would be difficult to detect. His internet search history, later recovered by investigators, showed disturbing queries including how to make murder look like natural causes, undetectable poisons, how long does cyanide stay in the body, arsenic poisoning symptoms, and tetrahydrozoline overdose. He was methodically researching which poisons would be most effective, how they could be disguised in food or drink, and how to avoid detection by medical examiners. On March 4, 2023, James placed an order through his dental practice accounts for potassium cyanide, a deadly poison sometimes used in certain dental and metallurgical procedures, but rarely ordered by general dentists. On March 6th, he ordered arsenic trioxide from another supplier. Both orders were shipped to his dental office, and James personally received and concealed the packages, not telling his staff what he had ordered or why. Beginning around March 6, 2023, Angela Craig began experiencing mysterious symptoms: severe headaches, dizziness, nausea, vomiting, and general malaise. She initially attributed these symptoms to a sinus infection or flu, but as they persisted and worsened, she became increasingly concerned. What Angela didn't know was that James had begun adding small amounts of arsenic to her morning protein shakes, a routine she had maintained for years as part of her fitness regimen. Drinking shakes that James would prepare for her before she started her day with the children. The arsenic poisoning caused Angela to feel progressively worse over several days. She visited her primary care physician, who diagnosed her with a viral illness and prescribed rest and fluids. But the symptoms continued to worsen. The headaches became debilitating. She couldn't keep food down. She experienced severe fatigue, and she developed a burning sensation in her mouth and throat. On March 9th, 2023, Angela's symptoms became so severe that James drove her to the emergency room at University of Colorado Hospital. At the hospital, doctors conducted blood tests, imaging studies, and a thorough physical examination, trying to determine what was causing Angela's symptoms. Her presentation was puzzling. The combination of gastrointestinal distress, neurological symptoms, and general systemic illness didn't fit neatly into any standard diagnostic category. Doctors considered various possibilities: viral infection, bacterial infection, autoimmune disorder, even early-stage cancer. What they didn't consider was poisoning, because why would they? Angela Craig was a healthy 43-year-old mother with no history of suicidal ideation or toxic exposures, and her devoted husband was by her side expressing concern and providing medical history. James played his role perfectly during this first hospitalization. He was the attentive husband, staying by Angela's bedside, asking intelligent questions about her treatment, appearing devastated by her illness. Behind this facade, he was calculating his next move. The arsenic had made Angela sick, but not sick enough to kill her, and the hospital stay meant she wasn't consuming the poisoned protein shakes he had been preparing. James needed to escalate his poisoning campaign. After 2 days of treatment with intravenous fluids and supportive care, Angela's symptoms improved slightly, and doctors discharged her on March 11th with instructions to follow up with her primary care physician and return to the emergency room if symptoms worsened. Angela went home, relieved to be out of the hospital, but still feeling unwell, not knowing that she was returning to the source of her poisoning, her own home, where her husband had stockpiled deadly poisons and was waiting for his next opportunity to administer them. On March 12, 2023, Angela was back home recovering from her hospital stay, still feeling weak and sick, but hoping that with rest she would improve. James resumed his routine of preparing her morning protein shakes, and once again began adding poison. This time not just arsenic, but also tetrahydrozoline, an ingredient commonly found in over-the-counter eye drops like Visine that, when ingested in large quantities, can cause severe reactions including sedation, respiratory depression, and potentially death. James had ordered bottles of eye drops containing tetrahydrozoline and was extracting the active ingredient to add to Angela's drinks. Within hours of consuming her protein shake on March 12th, Angela experienced a severe reaction. She became lethargic. Her blood pressure dropped dangerously low. She had difficulty breathing, and she became disoriented and confused. Her brother-in-law, Mark Prey, who had traveled to Aurora to help the Craig family during Angela's mysterious illness, was at the house when Angela's condition deteriorated rapidly. Mark called James, who was at his dental office, and James instructed Mark to give Angela her antibiotic capsules that had been prescribed during her hospital stay for a suspected sinus infection. What Mark didn't know, what no one except James knew, was that James had carefully opened Angela's antibiotic capsules, dumped out the medication, and refilled them with powdered potassium cyanide. These deadly capsules sat in the medication bottle looking exactly like legitimate antibiotics, waiting to deliver a lethal dose of one of the most toxic poisons known to mankind. Potassium cyanide works by blocking the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level, essentially causing the victim to suffocate from the inside even while breathing normally. Death from cyanide poisoning can occur within minutes of ingesting a sufficient dose, accompanied by convulsions, loss of consciousness, and cardiac arrest. Mark, following James's instructions and having no reason to suspect anything was wrong with the medication, gave Angela several of the capsules. Within minutes, Angela's condition became critical. She bent over and couldn't hold herself up. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, and she appeared to be slipping into unconsciousness. Mark and his wife immediately recognized that Angela was experiencing a medical emergency far beyond the flu-like symptoms she had been dealing with, and they rushed her to the emergency room for the second time in 3 days. At the hospital on March 12th, Angela was in grave condition. Her vital signs were unstable. She was barely responsive, and doctors were struggling to understand what was happening. Blood tests showed abnormalities, but the specific toxicology screens that would detect cyanide or arsenic are not part of standard emergency room blood panels. They must be specifically ordered when poisoning is suspected, and at this point, no one suspected poisoning. Doctors treated Angela's symptoms supportively with intravenous fluids, oxygen, and medications to stabilize her blood pressure and heart rate. Over the next 24 hours, Angela showed slight improvement with aggressive medical intervention. Her body, resilient despite the onslaught of poisons, began to recover as the immediate effects of the cyanide dose dissipated and her organs fought to restore normal function. By March 13th, doctors were cautiously optimistic that whatever had caused Angela's acute crisis was resolving, and they began discussing discharging her once again. But they remained puzzled by the pattern of her illness, the cycling between improvement and severe deterioration, the combination of symptoms that didn't fit any standard disease process, and the general sense that something about this case didn't add up. On the evening of March 13th, Angela was feeling well enough to use her phone and connect with friends and family. She texted several friends about her mysterious illness, expressing frustration that doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong, but also expressing hope that she was finally on the mend. These text messages, later examined by investigators, showed a woman who was oriented, coherent, and looking forward to getting home to her children, not someone who was suicidal or giving up on life. Angela also made plans for her daughter's upcoming birthday party, discussing decorations and cake flavors with friends, making it clear she expected to be alive and well for the celebration. That same evening, James was at home and online, engaging in romantic text exchanges with his orthodontist mistress. He sent her messages saying he couldn't wait to be with her, that soon everything would be different, that he was looking forward to their future together. The juxtaposition of these messages sent while his wife lay in a hospital bed, fighting for her life from poisons he had administered, would later be presented to the jury as evidence of James's cold-blooded calculation and complete lack of remorse or empathy. On March 14th, Angela was discharged from the hospital for the second time with instructions to continue resting at home and to follow up with her primary care physician. She returned home still feeling weak but grateful to be out of the hospital again. James greeted her with apparent concern and devotion, helping her into the house, settling her into bed, bringing her water and medication. Behind his concerned facade, James was growing increasingly frustrated. Angela had survived 2 poisoning attempts, had been hospitalized twice, and was still alive. His plan to make her death look like natural illness was failing because Angela's body was too resilient and medical interventions were saving her each time she reached critical condition. James decided he needed to administer a final, definitely lethal dose, one that would kill Angela quickly and decisively before she could receive medical treatment. He still had potassium cyanide left from his original purchase, and he prepared a concentrated solution that would deliver a massive, unsurvivable dose. But he faced a problem. Angela was now wary of consuming anything unusual. After multiple episodes of severe illness, always seemed to follow eating or drinking. She had even mentioned to friends her suspicion that something in her diet was making her sick, though she hadn't yet made the connection to James deliberately poisoning her. James needed another opportunity, another method of administration that wouldn't raise Angela's suspicions. That opportunity came on the morning of March 15th, 2023, when Angela woke up feeling severely ill once again. She was experiencing the same constellation of symptoms, nausea, vomiting, weakness, disorientation, that had sent her to the hospital twice before. This time, Mark Prey was again at the house to help, and James once more instructed Mark to give Angela her antibiotic capsules. Mark, now extremely concerned about his sister-in-law's deteriorating condition and the pattern of these mysterious illnesses, gave Angela the capsules as instructed and immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived and found Angela in severe distress. Her breathing was labored, her blood pressure was dangerously low, her level of consciousness was declining. They began emergency treatment and transported her to the hospital for the 3rd time in 6 days. Angela arrived at the emergency room around noon on March 15th in critical condition. Doctors immediately began aggressive treatment, but her condition continued to deteriorate. By early afternoon, she was placed on a ventilator to support her breathing, and intensive care specialists were brought in to manage her care. Blood tests showed severe metabolic derangement and organ dysfunction consistent with severe poisoning, though doctors still hadn't identified the specific toxic agent causing Angela's illness. Around 4:00 p.m. on March 15th, James arrived at the hospital after finishing appointments at his dental office. He went to Angela's room in the intensive care unit where she lay unconscious, connected to multiple monitors and life support machines clinging to life. Nurses and doctors working in the ICU that afternoon would later testify that James's behavior was odd. He seemed more irritated than devastated. He asked pointed questions about Angela's prognosis and whether she would recover, and he seemed particularly interested in whether she would regain consciousness. What happened next became one of the most crucial and disputed elements of the case. According to prosecutors, sometime between 4:00 p.m. and 8:00 p.m. on March 15th, 2023, James Craig administered a final lethal dose of potassium cyanide to his unconscious wife as she lay in her hospital bed. The prosecution's theory, supported by forensic toxicology evidence, was that James either injected the cyanide directly into Angela's IV line or administered it orally while nurses were out of the room, delivering a dose so massive that it would ensure her death even with full medical support available. The key evidence for this theory came from blood samples taken from Angela at 2 different times on March 15th. A blood sample taken around noon, shortly after she arrived at the hospital, showed cyanide levels in her system that were extremely elevated but potentially survivable with aggressive treatment. However, a blood sample taken around 8:00 p.m. after James had been at the hospital for several hours showed cyanide levels that had more than doubled, reaching concentrations that forensic toxicologist Dr. Justin Brower testified were among the highest I have ever seen and were absolutely lethal with no possibility of survival. This doubling of cyanide levels in Angela's blood over the course of a few hours while she was hospitalized and under constant medical supervision could only be explained by a second, massive dose of cyanide being administered during that time period. Since Angela was unconscious and on a ventilator, she couldn't have ingested anything orally on her own. The only person who had access to her, opportunity to tamper with her IV medications or administer substances, and motive to ensure she died was her husband, James Craig. Around 6:00 p.m. on March 15th, a nurse working in the ICU noticed James Craig suddenly rush out of Angela's room and urgently report that his wife's arm was hurting, that she had somehow communicated pain to him. This report struck the medical staff as extremely odd, because Angela was deeply unconscious, sedated, on a ventilator, and showing signs of severe brain swelling that would make her incapable of communicating anything, let alone something as specific as arm pain. Dr. Peter Sotil, a pulmonologist and critical care specialist, was called to evaluate Angela after James's report of arm pain. Dr. Sotil rushed Angela to a CT scanner to look for possible blood clots or other acute problems that might explain sudden arm pain. What the CT scan revealed was catastrophic. Angela had developed massive, severe swelling in her brain, cerebral edema so extensive that it was incompatible with survival. Dr. Sotil testified that he was surprised and confused by James's report that Angela had communicated arm pain, because someone with that level of brain swelling would be completely unable to speak or communicate in any way. This testimony suggested that James's report of Angela experiencing arm pain was fabricated, possibly to explain why he had been in her room alone and to create a cover story for when medical staff discovered her rapidly deteriorating neurological condition. Prosecutors theorized that the arm pain story was James's attempt to explain away the effects of the lethal cyanide dose he had just administered. The burning, painful sensation that cyanide causes as it kills cells, which Angela might have briefly felt before losing consciousness completely. By 8:00 p.m. on March 15, 2023, Angela Craig was declared brain dead. The massive cerebral edema, the result of the lethal cyanide dose combined with the cumulative effects of days of poisoning with arsenic and tetrahydrozoline, had destroyed her brain function beyond any possibility of recovery. Life support was continued temporarily, while family members gathered to say goodbye. But Angela was effectively dead, killed by the man she had married 23 years earlier, the father of her 6 children, the person she had trusted to prepare her meals and medications, the person who had taken an oath to do no harm but had instead become her murderer. On March 16, 2023, Angela Craig's family made the heartbreaking decision to withdraw life support, and Angela was officially pronounced dead at 1:03 p.m. Her 6 children, ranging in age from elementary school to college, had lost their mother to what they still believed at that moment was a mysterious illness that doctors had been unable to diagnose or treat. James Craig played his role as grieving widower, crying with his children, hugging family members, accepting condolences from friends and neighbors who had no idea that the cause of Angela's death was standing right in front of them. But even before Angela's life support was withdrawn, wheels were already turning that would expose James Craig's crimes. The medical team treating Angela had become increasingly suspicious about the pattern and nature of her illnesses. Dr. Scott Burridge, one of the emergency medicine physicians who had treated Angela during her multiple hospitalizations, had consulted with colleagues about the unusual presentation of her symptoms and the progression of her decline. The repeated hospitalizations, the cycling between improvement and severe deterioration, the combination of gastrointestinal, neurological, and cardiovascular symptoms, and the ultimate catastrophic brain swelling all pointed towards some form of toxic exposure rather than natural disease. On March 15th, even before Angela was declared brain dead, Dr. Burridge contacted Aurora Police Department to report his suspicions that Angela Craig might be a victim of poisoning. This call initiated a cascade of investigative activities that would ultimately unravel James Craig's entire scheme. Detective Bobby Olson from the Aurora Police Department Major Crimes Homicide Unit was assigned to investigate, and she immediately began gathering information about Angela Craig, her medical history, her family situation, and the circumstances of her mysterious illness. One of Detective Olson's first actions was to order comprehensive toxicology testing on blood samples that had been taken from Angela during her hospitalizations. Standard hospital blood panels don't test for exotic poisons like cyanide or arsenic. These substances require specialized testing that must be specifically requested. Detective Olson requested full toxicology screens, including tests for heavy metals, cyanide, tetrahydrozoline, and other potential poisons. The toxicology results, which came back over the next several days, were shocking and definitive. Angela Craig's blood contained lethal concentrations of potassium cyanide, significantly elevated levels of tetrahydrozoline, and evidence of chronic arsenic poisoning. The medical examiner who performed Angela's autopsy, Dr. Kelly Lear Call, determined Angela's official cause of death as poisoning by cyanide and tetrahydrozoline, with arsenic poisoning listed as a significant contributing factor. The manner of death was ruled homicide. Angela Craig had been murdered through deliberate poisoning. Armed with this information, Detective Olson began investigating who had access to poison Angela, who had motive to want her dead, and who had opportunity to administer multiple doses of different poisons over a period of days. Every investigative lead pointed directly to James Craig. He was Angela's husband. He prepared her food and drinks. He had access to her medications. He had medical knowledge and access to controlled substances through his dental practice, and he had been present or nearby during each of Angela's medical crises. On March 17, 2023, 2 days after Angela's death, Detective Olson obtained a search warrant for the Craig family home and James's dental office. Executing these search warrants would prove to be the turning point in building the case against James. At the Craig home, investigators found bottles of eye drops with reduced amounts of product suggesting the contents had been extracted, protein shake powder that Angela had been consuming daily, Angela's pill bottles including the antibiotics that had been tampered with, and Angela's personal journals and diaries spanning several years. The journal entries became crucial evidence, though not in the way the title of this case suggests. Defense attorneys would later try to use Angela's old journal entries from 2009 and 2018 periods when she had experienced depression related to James's infidelities, to suggest that Angela might have been suicidal and could have poisoned herself. They pointed to entries where Angela had written, "I feel depressed. I feel a huge sense of loss with no hope," and similar expressions of emotional pain, arguing that these showed Angela was capable of self-harm. But prosecutors demolished this defense theory by presenting Angela's recent journal entries and writings from 2022 and early 2023. These entries painted a picture of a woman who was moving forward, making plans, focusing on her children's futures, and actively working to improve her life despite the challenges in her marriage. On March 14th, 2023, just one day before she died, Angela had written in her journal about plans for her daughter's birthday party, about enrolling her youngest children in summer programs, and about her own plans to start a small business she had been researching. Most significantly, Angela had written, "What is it that I want? Number 1, move forward." This entry, written when Angela knew her marriage was troubled, but while she was actively planning her future, directly contradicted any suggestion that she was suicidal or would poison herself. The prosecution team, referred to by some as Angela's team because of how invested they became in securing justice for her, used these journal entries to show the jury who Angela really was: a loving mother, a woman with plans and dreams, someone who wanted to move forward with her life, not end it. At James Craig's dental office, investigators made even more damning discoveries. They found shipping records showing James had ordered potassium cyanide and arsenic trioxide in early March 2023, substances that had no legitimate purpose in a general dental practice. They found James's work computer, which when forensically examined revealed his disturbing internet search history. How to make murder look like natural death, undetectable poisons, how long does cyanide stay in the body, can you be charged with murder without a body, and dozens of similar searches conducted in the days and weeks before Angela fell ill. Perhaps most incriminating, investigators found evidence of James's affair with his orthodontist mistress. Text messages between James and this woman showed him expressing frustration with his marriage, saying he felt trapped, discussing his desire to be free to be with her, and making references to being able to start their life together soon. Messages sent on March 15th, the day Angela died, included James telling his mistress, "Soon everything will be different," and "I'll be free to be with you." On March 19th, 2023, just 4 days after Angela's death, and before her funeral had even taken place, James Craig was arrested at his dental office and charged with first-degree murder, solicitation to commit murder, and tampering with physical evidence. The arrest shocked the Aurora community. James had been preparing for his wife's funeral, had been receiving sympathy and support from friends and colleagues, and had been maintaining his facade as the grieving widower. Now he was in handcuffs, being led to a patrol car, facing a murder charge that could result in life in prison. The evidence against James was overwhelming, but prosecutors knew they needed to build an airtight case because juries are often reluctant to convict respected professionals like doctors and dentists of premeditated murder. District Attorney Michael Rourke and his prosecution team spent the next 2 years meticulously preparing for trial, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, analyzing thousands of pages of medical records, consulting with forensic toxicologists and medical experts, and documenting every aspect of James's poisoning campaign. During this pre-trial period, James Craig managed to make his legal situation even worse. While incarcerated at the Arapahoe County Jail awaiting trial, James began plotting to sabotage the prosecution's case and eliminate witnesses. In late 2023 and early 2024, prosecutors received information that James had been attempting to orchestrate a murder-for-hire plot from jail, specifically targeting Detective Bobby Olson, the lead investigator on his case. According to testimony from fellow inmates who reported James's schemes to authorities, James had approached multiple inmates asking if they knew anyone who could kill Detective Olson and make it look like an accident. He also asked inmates to help him fabricate evidence that would support his defense theory that Angela had committed suicide. Specifically, James wanted inmates who were being released to break into his former home and plant forged journal entries that would make it appear Angela had been suicidal and planning to kill herself. These jailhouse plots resulted in additional charges being filed against James: solicitation to commit first-degree murder for the murder-for-hire plot against Detective Olson, solicitation to commit tampering with physical evidence for the scheme to plant fake journal entries, and solicitation to commit perjury in the first degree for attempting to get witnesses to lie. These charges demonstrated James's continued attempts to manipulate the justice system and his complete lack of remorse or acceptance of responsibility for his crimes. The trial of James Craig began on July 15, 2025, in Arapahoe County District Court in Centennial, Colorado. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, Angela's family and friends, and members of the public who had followed the case through extensive pre-trial coverage. James entered the courtroom wearing a suit, flanked by his defense attorneys, appearing calm and composed, a stark contrast to the methodical poisoner that prosecutors would portray over the next 2 weeks of testimony. Jury selection had taken several days, with attorneys on both sides carefully screening potential jurors for their ability to fairly evaluate complex medical and forensic evidence, their attitudes towards circumstantial evidence, and their willingness to consider the death penalty, though prosecutors had decided not to seek capital punishment in this case, given Colorado's recent abolition of the death penalty. The final jury consisted of 7 women and 5 men, representing a cross-section of Arapahoe County residents who would now be asked to determine James Craig's guilt or innocence based on the evidence presented. In his opening statement, prosecutor Michael Morrow laid out the prosecution's theory of the case in stark, simple terms. James Craig was a narcissistic, manipulative husband who felt trapped in his marriage, wanted to be with his mistress without the financial burden of divorce, and used his medical knowledge and access to poisons to systematically murder his wife while attempting to make it look like natural illness or suicide. Morrow told the jury they would hear testimony from 48 witnesses, see hundreds of pieces of documentary evidence, including James's internet searches and text messages, and ultimately conclude that no reasonable explanation existed for Angela Craig's death, except deliberate murder by her husband. Morrow introduced the jury to Angela through photos and videos, showing them a vibrant, loving mother who was devoted to her children, who had overcome personal challenges and depression in the past, and who was actively planning her future when she died. He emphasized that Angela's journal entries from the weeks before her death showed a woman moving forward with her life, not contemplating suicide. He told the jury that the defense would try to use Angela's old journal entries about depression to suggest suicide, but that this theory was demolished by the forensic evidence showing multiple different poisons administered in a pattern consistent with deliberate homicide. Defense attorney Lisa Moses delivered a very different opening statement. She acknowledged that James Craig was entirely dishonest about his affairs and had engaged in morally reprehensible behavior by cheating on his wife. But she argued that being a bad husband doesn't make someone a murderer. Moses suggested that Angela Craig may have taken her own life using poisons she somehow obtained, that the investigation had been rushed and incomplete, and that reasonable doubt existed about James's guilt. She referenced Angela's old journal entries about depression and asked the jury to consider whether Angela might have been suicidal, despite her more recent positive writings. Moses also attacked the forensic evidence, suggesting that the presence of poisons in Angela's system didn't prove James administered them, that Angela could have obtained these substances herself, and that the prosecution's timeline and theory of how the poisons were administered was speculative. It was a defense strategy that acknowledged some uncomfortable facts: James's affairs, his suspicious internet searches, his cold behavior, while trying to create just enough reasonable doubt to prevent conviction. The prosecution's case unfolded over 8 days and included devastating testimony from medical experts, forensic toxicologists, law enforcement officers, and members of Angela's family. Dr. Kelly Lear Call, the medical examiner who performed Angela's autopsy, testified about the extensive damage the poisons had caused to Angela's organs and tissues. She explained that the levels of cyanide found in Angela's blood were among the highest she had ever seen in her career as a forensic pathologist, that these levels could only have resulted from deliberate administration of massive doses, and that there was no plausible way Angela could have ingested such quantities accidentally or even intentionally without someone helping her. Dr. Justin Brower, the forensic toxicologist, provided crucial testimony about the timeline of Angela's poisoning. He walked the jury through the blood test results from March 15th, showing how Angela's cyanide levels more than doubled between noon and 8 p.m. that day. He testified that this dramatic increase could only be explained by a second massive dose being administered during that time window, when Angela was unconscious in the hospital and James was the only person with her. Dr. Brower calculated that the final dose of cyanide James administered was approximately 12,000 times the amount naturally present in foods, making it absolutely clear this was homicidal poisoning, rather than any kind of accidental or self-inflicted exposure. The prosecution also called Dr. Peter Suicidal, the pulmonologist who had treated Angela on March 15th. His testimony about James's suspicious report that Angela was experiencing arm pain, despite Angela being deeply unconscious with massive brain swelling, painted a picture of James fabricating medical information to cover up his actions. Dr. Suicidal expressed his professional opinion that Angela's reported arm pain was not medically plausible given her neurological state, and that this false report coincided suspiciously with the time period when the fatal cyanide dose was administered. Testimony from the Aurora Police Department included presentation of James's internet search history, which prosecutors displayed on large screens throughout the courtroom. Jurors saw search after search showing James researching how to commit undetectable murder, how various poisons work, how long they remain in the body, and whether someone can be charged with murder without direct evidence. These searches, conducted in the weeks before Angela fell ill, demonstrated premeditation and planning that directly contradicted any claim this was an accidental death or suicide. The most emotionally devastating testimony came from Angela's family and friends. Her brother Mark Prey testified about giving Angela the tampered antibiotic capsules on James's instructions, describing the horrible guilt he felt knowing he had unwittingly administered the poison that contributed to his sister's death. He broke down on the stand recounting how Angela had collapsed after taking the capsules, how he had rushed her to the hospital, and how he had believed he was helping her get medical treatment, when in reality, he was helping James complete his murder plot. Nicole Harmon, Angela's close friend, testified about James's 2019 confession that he had contemplated murder-suicide. She described how James had admitted to her and her husband that he had thought about killing himself and drugging Angela so she couldn't stop him. This testimony showed the jury that James had been thinking about killing Angela for years, that the March 2023 poisoning wasn't an impulsive act, but the culmination of long-standing homicidal ideation that James had finally decided to act upon. Perhaps most powerful was testimony from 3 of James and Angela's 6 children. These young adults, ranging in age from late teens to mid-20s, took the stand to testify against their own father. They described their mother as a loving, devoted parent who had been their rock through difficult times, who had worked hard to keep the family together despite James's affairs, and who had been planning activities and events right up until her death. They described how they had noticed changes in their mother's health, how she had complained about feeling ill after drinking her protein shakes, and how their father had seemed oddly unconcerned about her deteriorating condition. One daughter testified that on March 14th, the day before Angela died, her mother had been discussing plans for her upcoming birthday party, talking about what kind of cake she wanted and which friends to invite. This testimony directly refuted the defense claim that Angela was suicidal, showing instead a mother actively engaged in her children's lives and planning for the future. Another daughter testified that in the days before her death, Angela had told her she suspected something in her diet was making her sick, and had mentioned she was going to stop drinking the protein shakes James prepared for her, a decision that, if carried out, would have thwarted James's poisoning plan and possibly saved her life. The prosecution also presented extensive evidence of James's relationship with his mistress. Text messages between James and the orthodontist showed him expressing love for her, frustration with being stuck in his marriage, and anticipation of being free to be with her. Messages sent on March 15th, the day Angela died, included James writing, "Soon I'll be free, and can't wait for our future together." These messages, sent while Angela lay dying in the hospital from poisons James had administered, demonstrated his complete lack of remorse and his focus on his own desires rather than his wife's suffering. The defense case was remarkably brief, lasting less than 2 days. James's attorneys called no witnesses to testify on his behalf, presenting no alternative theory of how the poisons entered Angela's system, and offering no explanation for James's damning internet searches and suspicious behavior. This decision suggested the defense had concluded that their best chance was to attack the prosecution's evidence rather than present affirmative evidence of innocence. In her cross-examination of prosecution witnesses, defense attorney Lisa Moses focused on trying to create alternative explanations and sow doubt. She questioned whether Angela might have obtained poisons herself and self-administered them. She suggested the shipping records for the cyanide and arsenic might have been fraudulent, or that someone else could have used James's accounts to order the substances. She questioned whether Angela's death could have been the result of cumulative poisoning over months or years, rather than acute poisoning in March 2023, as prosecutors claimed. But most significantly, Moses attempted to use Angela's own journal entries to suggest suicide was possible. She read to the jury excerpts from Angela's 2009 journal, where Angela had written about feeling depressed after discovering one of James's affairs. "I feel depressed. I feel a huge sense of loss with no hope." She read similar entries from 2018, when Angela was again dealing with the fallout of James's infidelities. Moses argued that these entries showed Angela had a history of depression and suicidal ideation, that she might have been hiding continued depression from her family and friends, and that the prosecution couldn't definitively rule out suicide as a possibility. This strategy backfired spectacularly during the prosecution's rebuttal. Prosecutor Michael Mauro methodically walked the jury through Angela's more recent journal entries, showing a completely different picture than the cherry-picked excerpts the defense had presented. He showed entries from January and February 2023, where Angela wrote about being excited for her children's upcoming milestones, about business ideas she was exploring, about plans to redecorate her home. He showed her March 14th entry, the day before she died, where she wrote explicitly, "What is it that I want? Number 1, move forward." Mauro pointed out the logical absurdity of the defense theory. If Angela had been planning to kill herself, why would she be making detailed plans for her daughter's birthday party the day before? Why would she be researching summer programs for her children? Why would she write about wanting to move forward rather than about wanting to end her life? And most importantly, how would Angela, who had no medical training and no access to pharmaceutical supplies, have obtained pharmaceutical-grade potassium cyanide and arsenic trioxide, the exact substances that James had ordered through his dental practice accounts days before her symptoms began? Mauro also addressed the defense's suggestion that Angela might have poisoned herself with the cyanide-laced antibiotic capsules. He pointed out that Angela had taken those capsules on James's explicit instructions, delivered through Mark Prey, when Angela was already severely ill and seeking relief from her symptoms. The idea that Angela would have poisoned herself and then asked her brother-in-law to give her more poison, while begging for medical help, defied common sense and was contradicted by every piece of evidence in the case. Closing arguments in the James Craig trial took place on July 29, 2025, and they provided both sides with their final opportunity to persuade the jury. Prosecutor Michael Mauro delivered a powerful summation that tied together all the evidence presented over 2 weeks of testimony. He walked the jury through the timeline of Angela's poisoning, showing how each piece of evidence, the poison purchases, the internet searches, the text messages to the mistress, the medical records, the journal entries, fit together into an inescapable conclusion. James Craig had murdered his wife through deliberate, calculated poisoning. Mauro addressed the defense's suicide theory head-on, calling it desperate and offensive to Angela's memory. He reminded the jury that Angela had 6 children she loved deeply, that she was planning her future right up until the day she died, and that no evidence whatsoever suggested she wanted to end her life. He pointed to Angela's journal entry, "What is it that I want? Number 1, move forward," and told the jury, "These are not the words of someone planning suicide. These are the words of a survivor, a woman who had been through difficulties but was determined to keep going, to build a future for herself and her children. James Craig stole that future from her." Mauro also addressed the circumstantial nature of some of the evidence, acknowledging that no one had actually witnessed James administering the poisons to Angela. But he explained that circumstantial evidence can be just as powerful as direct evidence when it forms an unbreakable chain of proof. He gave the jury an analogy. If you go to bed at night and the ground is dry, and when you wake up the ground is wet, the trees are wet, the cars are wet, and everything outside is wet, you don't need to have witnessed the rain falling to know that it rained during the night. The evidence tells you what happened even if you didn't see it directly. Mauro concluded his closing argument with an emotional appeal. Angela Craig was innocent. She had no role in her own death. The only person claiming she killed herself is the man sitting right there, the man who ordered the poisons, who researched how to commit undetectable murder, who stood to gain financially from her death, who was planning a future with another woman. This man, James Craig, is guilty of the ultimate betrayal. He murdered the mother of his children, and he needs to be held accountable. Defense attorney Lisa Moses delivered her closing argument immediately after Mauro, and she faced an uphill battle. She began by acknowledging what she called the elephant in the room: James Craig's affairs, his dishonesty, his morally reprehensible behavior. But she insisted this didn't make him a murderer. She argued that the prosecution had presented a compelling story, but that stories aren't proof beyond reasonable doubt. Moses tried once more to suggest that Angela might have been depressed and suicidal despite her outward appearance of moving forward. She referenced the old journal entries again, suggesting that Angela might have been hiding her true feelings from everyone. She questioned whether the prosecution had definitively proven that James was the only person who could have administered the poisons, suggesting vaguely that someone else with access to the home might have poisoned Angela, though she offered no evidence for this theory and no suggestion of who this mysterious other poisoner might be. Moses concluded by telling the jury that convicting someone of murder requires absolute certainty, not just a compelling narrative. She urged them to carefully consider whether the prosecution had met their burden of proof beyond reasonable doubt, or whether gaps and uncertainties remained that required them to find James not guilty. It was a valiant effort, but it was clear from the jury's attentive, skeptical expressions that Moses had not succeeded in creating the reasonable doubt she needed. The jury retired to deliberate at approximately 3:30 p.m. on July 29, 2025. They deliberated for the remainder of that afternoon, returned the next morning on July 30th, and continued their discussions until early afternoon. At approximately 2 p.m. on July 30th, after less than a full day of deliberation, the jury sent word to Judge Marcus Sparks that they had reached unanimous verdicts on all charges. The courtroom was hastily reconvened. Angela's family members filled the seats on the prosecution's side. Her parents, her siblings, her close friends, all gathered to hear whether justice would be delivered for Angela. James Craig sat at the defense table flanked by his attorneys, his face showing the first signs of real emotion, fear, as he realized his fate was about to be announced. 3 of his 6 children were in the courtroom, seated in the front row behind the prosecutors, having chosen to align themselves with seeking justice for their mother rather than supporting their father. Judge Sparks asked the jury foreperson if they had reached verdicts, and the foreperson, a woman in her 50s who had been attentive and engaged throughout the trial, confirmed that they had. The clerk began reading the verdicts. On the charge of first-degree murder of Angela Craig, we the jury find the defendant James Stephen Craig guilty. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Angela's mother collapsed into sobs, held up by family members beside her. Several of Angela's friends openly wept. James Craig's children, who were present, showed no reaction. They had expected this verdict and had already come to terms with their father's guilt months ago. The clerk continued, "On the charge of solicitation to commit first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. This charge related to James's jailhouse plot to have Detective Bobby Olson killed. On the charge of solicitation to commit tampering with physical evidence, we find the defendant guilty. This charge related to James's attempt to have fake journal entries planted to support his suicide theory. On the charge of solicitation to commit perjury in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. 2 counts. Guilty on all charges. James Craig sat motionless, his face pale, as the verdicts were read. He had been convicted of murdering his wife and of attempting to obstruct justice through elaborate jailhouse schemes. He now faced mandatory life imprisonment without possibility of parole on the first-degree murder conviction alone, with additional years to be added for the solicitation charges. Judge Sparks set sentencing for August 15, 2025, giving Angela's family time to prepare victim impact statements and allowing the probation department to prepare a presentence investigation report. James was immediately remanded to custody and returned to the Arapahoe County Jail, where he had been held throughout the trial. The sentencing hearing on August 15th provided Angela's family with their opportunity to address James directly and to tell the court about the impact of his crimes. Angela's mother, Sandra, delivered a statement describing Angela as a devoted daughter and mother who had been her best friend, and who had been taken from the family in the most cruel way imaginable. She spoke about the 6 grandchildren who had lost their mother and who would grow up without her guidance, love, and presence at the milestones of their lives. Angela's brother, Mark Prey, who had unwittingly administered the poisoned capsules to his sister, delivered an emotional statement about the guilt and trauma he had experienced since learning he had played a role in Angela's death, even though he had been manipulated by James into doing so. He told James directly, "You didn't just kill my sister. You made me an unwitting participant in her murder. I will carry that burden for the rest of my life because of your evil actions." 3 of James and Angela's adult children also delivered impact statements, and their words were devastating. One daughter described how her father had destroyed not just their mother, but their entire family, how she and her siblings had been left orphaned in effect, their mother dead, their father imprisoned for her murder. Another daughter described the trauma of testifying against her own father, knowing that her testimony would help convict him, but feeling it was necessary to honor her mother's memory and ensure justice was served. James Craig was given an opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood at the defense table and delivered a brief statement that satisfied no one. "I'm sorry for the pain my actions have caused. I loved Angela, and I never meant for any of this to happen. I wish I could undo everything." His statement was notably vague. He didn't explicitly admit to murdering Angela, didn't explain his actions, didn't provide any real accounting for his crimes. It seemed more like a statement designed for potential appeals than a genuine expression of remorse. Judge Marcus Sparks delivered the sentence without hesitation. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the first-degree murder of Angela Craig, plus an additional 16 years for the solicitation charges. The sentences were ordered to run consecutively, though this was largely symbolic since James would never be eligible for release regardless. Judge Sparks addressed James directly, telling him, "You took an oath to do no harm. You had medical knowledge that you used not to heal but to kill. You murdered your wife, the mother of your sick children, through a prolonged campaign of poisoning that caused her immense suffering. You then tried to blame her for her own death and to manipulate the justice system through elaborate schemes. You will spend the rest of your life in prison, reflecting on what you've done." James Craig was immediately transported from the Arapahoe County Jail to the Colorado Department of Corrections, where he is currently incarcerated at Sterling Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison in northeast Colorado. At 47 years old, James will spend the next 40 to 50 years of his life in prison, dying behind bars for the murder of his wife. His dental license has been permanently revoked. His assets have been seized to pay restitution to Angela's estate and to cover his children's expenses. and his name has become synonymous with betrayal and calculated evil. The case of James Craig stands as a chilling reminder that medical professionals are not immune to committing heinous crimes, and that the same knowledge that enables doctors and dentists to heal can be perverted to harm when combined with narcissism, selfishness, and complete disregard for human life. James had every advantage: education, professional success, a loving family, and he threw it all away because he felt trapped in his marriage and wanted the freedom to be with his mistress without the inconvenience of divorce proceedings. The journal entries that gave this case its title ended up being a two-edged sword. The defense tried to use Angela's old journal entries about depression to suggest she was suicidal, but the prosecution used Angela's recent journal entries to prove the opposite, that Angela was a woman planning her future, excited about her children's lives, and determined to move forward despite the difficulties in her marriage. The journal entry: "What is it that I want?" 1. Move forward became a rallying cry for the prosecution and for Angela's supporters, symbolizing her determination to survive and thrive despite James's betrayals. But it wasn't just the journal entries that sealed James's fate. It was the totality of the evidence. The forensic toxicology proving deliberate poisoning with multiple different substances. The internet searches showing premeditation and research into undetectable murder methods. The poison purchases through James's dental practice accounts. The text messages to his mistress expressing anticipation of being free. The medical testimony showing Angela's cyanide levels doubled while she was hospitalized, and James was the only person with her. The jailhouse plots to tamper with evidence and kill the investigating detective. All of this evidence combined to create an overwhelming case that left the jury with no reasonable doubt about James's guilt. For Angela Craig's sick children, there is no happy ending, no closure that makes their loss bearable. They have lost their mother to murder and their father to prison. They have been orphaned by James's crimes and will spend the rest of their lives dealing with the trauma of knowing one parent murdered the other. The older children, who testified against their father, showed remarkable courage and moral clarity in choosing justice for their mother over loyalty to their father, but that choice came with immense emotional cost that they will process for years to come. The case also highlights the importance of recognizing patterns in unexplained medical symptoms. Angela Craig went to the hospital 3 times in 6 days with mysterious symptoms that puzzled doctors. It was only after her death, when doctors specifically looked for toxic causes, that the poisoning was discovered. The case has been used in medical education to teach emergency physicians and toxicologists about recognizing patterns consistent with intentional poisoning, potentially saving future victims whose symptoms might otherwise be attributed to natural causes. The title of this case, Doctor Poisons His Wife. Slowly over months, her journal entries sealed his fate, captures the essence of how a medical professional betrayed his oath and his family, using his knowledge to commit murder while attempting to hide behind a false narrative of suicide. Angela's journal entries didn't just seal James's fate. They gave her a voice beyond the grave, allowing her to testify through her own words about her state of mind, her plans for the future, and her determination to move forward. Those words, preserved in her handwriting, were her final gift to her children and to the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring her killer to justice. James Craig will die in prison, his legacy reduced to being a cautionary tale about the dangers of narcissism, infidelity, and the perversion of medical knowledge for evil purposes. Angela Craig's legacy is her 6 children, who survive her and who are working to build lives honoring their mother's memory and determination. She was a victim of domestic violence in its most insidious form. Not physical abuse, but slow, deliberate poisoning by the person she trusted most. Her story serves as a reminder that domestic violence doesn't always look like bruises and broken bones. Sometimes it looks like an attentive husband preparing his wife's morning protein shake while secretly adding poison to it. The case concludes with justice served, but lives shattered. A family destroyed by one man's selfish desire to escape his obligations without facing the consequences. Angela Craig deserved better than the husband who murdered her. Her children deserved better than the father who orphaned them. And the community deserved better than the dentist who betrayed his oath and his profession.